going live, which is why time becomes critical, even when the clock is not with us. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London held on Thursday, 2nd of March 2023 at the University of Cardiff in Cardiff. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 23rd February 2023 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Fonmon Castle Landscape Archaeology Project. Results from the first 2 years of survey and excavation by Dr. Andy Seaman, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, 9th of March 2023, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statute, desires to be admitted a fellow. Christopher Claxton Stevens.
We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear our paper from our fellow Peter Brown, MBE. Peter was educated in Sheffield and Leeds, worked at the National Trust before moving to York in 1984 as the first director of Fairfax House, became company secretary to York Civic Trust in 2006, and its director from 2009 to 2015. His interests lay mainly in architecture and material culture, especially that of the long 18th century. He's curated a huge number, 14 exhibitions, related catalogues, some of which toured York to London and Norwich, whilst one display travelled to the Library of Getty in LA for their exhibition in 2000 entitled The Edible Monument. His published works include numerous papers for national and international journals, symposia, and 4 books. He's lecturing to us this evening on Wentworth Woodhouse, new evidence concerning the design and furnishing of the Yorkshire Palace. Welcome, Peter.
Great pleasure to be here, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me well. I hope the Zoom people can hear me well. First of all, I would like to give a big thank you to Sarah McLeod, who's the chief exec at Wentworth Woodhouse, and to her team. They've been unfailingly generous and helpful to me in not only the preparation of this talk, but also trying to put together a book about the house and its collections, past and present. The various institutions like the RIBA and Courtauld, you name it, they've been incredibly unfailing in their generosity and support. The archivists at Sheffield Archives could not have been more helpful. And the family, in particular, Lady Juliet Tadgell, were tremendously supportive, helpful, and giving me access to things which I think had never been really recognized before. And last but not least, just to say thank you to Christie's, who have very kindly given copies of the auctioneers' catalogues for the sales in the 1940s through to the 90s, annotated who bought the items. So it's a great opportunity for future scholars and researchers to be able to follow that through. This particular watercolor, or more likely colored engraving, was completed by Nathaniel Whittock in the 1830s. And actually, I have seen another version of this, whereas the animals in the foreground were llamas and buffaloes, which it's such a shame I don't have a picture of that, but certainly Lord Rockingham had a very fine menagerie. Now, the story really starts with this gentleman, Thomas Wentworth, later to become first Earl of Strafford. He'd had a very sort of interesting political life, and I'm sure many of you will know it, culminating in his death in 1641. But what you probably don't realize is that he considered himself a very fine amateur architect. When he was on the his grand tour, he met Sir Henry Wotton in Venice, and they were regular correspondents over time. And one of Wotton's great pieces of advice was that you should not just accept a two-dimensional drawing of a building. You really need to make a model. And I think many an architect today, I think, follow that advice. So he wrote to his friend, Lord Clifford, saying that he'd been at cards that weekend. Not the sort of cards that you play, my lord, but these are playing cards that I cut up and paste together to make my models. And he got great pleasure out of doing that. Throughout his political career, he dabbled in architecture. At the King's Manor in York, when he was president of the Council of the North, he built a whole new wing, which made an open courtyard into a quadrangle. When he was in Dublin Castle, he brought it up to speed, made it much more habitable for king and, of course, for himself. He built a huge, enormous hunting lodge called Jigginstown, which he had expected the king to contribute towards the cost, but didn't. So it was a tremendous financial folly. And then he bought monastic land just outside Leeds and was building a house from scratch called Ledston, which is now being restored and is going to be let out as apartments. You can hire or you can purchase an apartment there, which is a fascinating building. Anyway, the lady on your left, described by other people at the time as dangerously attractive, was Lucy, Countess of Carlisle, the recently widowed Lucy. And I think Wentworth had a great passion for her. He commissioned Van Dyck to make a copy of the painting. And in the correspondence, which is in the Sheffield Archive, he talked about, he was very happy for the setting and the costume to be done by the studio, but Van Dyck must do the face. And he also arranged for it to be transported from London by water round to Dublin instead of going straight to Wentworth Woodhouse. So it certainly suggests something to me that he wanted it to be a private and didn't want his wife really to know about it. Anyway, the original, I think, is now in Washington. But the majestic portrait of the Earl of Strafford in his armor, he did actually become, right towards the end, he became the commander of the army, although having never seen any battles. Anyway, both Van Dycks, both still in the family collection. Very little evidence survives of the architecture of Wentworth Woodhouse when Thomas took over in 1618. There is this doorway, which is based upon Dieterling's Architectura, which was published in 1598, and very faithfully executed by the Yorkshire masons. There is another fireplace which has been moved. It now guards the entrance to the bear pit in the walled garden. So the shape, maybe that should come back to somewhere within the proper building. He had 3 children. William, who became the second Earl of Strafford, Anne and Arabella. Anne was to marry the Watsons from Rockingham Castle, and the line perpetuated from there because William did not have children. Another Van Dyck, which again, still in the family collection. I just had very little evidence of what the old building used to look like. Now, somebody at some time must have applied for a license to crenulate, because you can see that the main block and the adjoining wings are castellated. You actually needed a license from the Crown to do that. And on the left-hand side, you can see what was the old stables, and on the right, the stepped terrace in the garden with the line of trees as a windbreak above. When the second Earl of Strafford died, it was the turn of the Watsons, who then took the name of Watson Wentworth. And here we have the young man who married into the Finch family. And Mary Finch was one of a number of children from that great statesman, the second Earl of Nottingham, all very cultured, artistic ladies. And this fine marriage portrait by Kneller is still at Wentworth Woodhouse. Now, his idea of architecture was quite interesting. The west front was going to be built, what Pevner said, in the Bavarian Baroque style, which was, he didn't mean it kindly. And we still really don't know who the architect was. There is a floor plan in the RIBA libraries, which actually raises more questions than it gives answers to. But we know that William Thornton of York was involved in the building of it. Whether he was all involved in the design, we don't know. But William Etty of York is another name being thrown into the pot. And the Dutch architect who was involved with Wentworth Castle also put forward. But the west front today is not the dominant front as it had been, with those curious curved Venetian windows, the elaborate detailing in the fluting, the armorial and Masonic emblems in the frieze. And guarding the front door is a very fine macaw, keeping a very beady eye on whoever is visiting. Very little of the interior of this 1728 design survives, except in the entrance hall, where you can see above the doors these busts of Apollo and Diana, actually the family in the guise of. The furniture, we know, I'll talk about the side tables later, this Italianate cabinet with a small model of the torment of Queen Duchy, and big plaster plaques added later. So Lord Rockingham, and he inherited, got very involved in plaster copies of ancient scenes. So this is so-called Albani Antinous or Antinius, it depends who you read. I'll stick to Antinous if that's all right. The other plaque being Priam pleading with Achilles for the body of his son Hector. The tables, these majestic tables, actually had originally been at Ditchley, but they're very, very similar to what had been at Wentworth Woodhouse. And we're still on the trail to find them. There are only very minor details to the treatment of the legs, but the big Herculean mask with the lion's pelt, probably supplied by a man named Benjamin Goodison. In the 1730s, an artist named Charles Phillips painted this and another number of portraits showing, it's entitled The Finch Family, but it actually shows the Watson Wentworth people as well. So on this ancient temple probably was existing. It just seems very too well articulated to just be a fantasy. And then this other modern Palladian building, again, we still yet to find the source of that. On the left, we have Henrietta, who later became Duchess of Cleveland, and an amateur sculptor in her own right. And you can see her pointing to the bust, which was sold through Sotheby's about 7 or 8 years ago, showing her sort of looking up to the light, very much like Saint Cecilia. On the right-hand side, we've got Mary with baby Charles on her lap. And Charles was the younger of the two boys. William, which I think is I think this is supposedly William, not yet breached. He died young when he was only 18, and Charles took over. But here on the right, we can see Thomas Watson Wentworth, who was given the Order of the Bath in 1725. He was immensely proud of that. And he may well have been one of the first to ever receive that chivalric award. And he's standing next to Lady Bell, as she was known, Isabella, who was commissioned Kent to build her townhouse in Berkeley Square. Now, in probably due to the influence of the Finch girls, Thomas decided he needed a Palladian mansion rather than a Bavarian Baroque. So he asked a local architect named Ralph Tunnicliffe to design it, and it had to be the longest facade in Britain, which it was, and still is, I think, at 606 feet. It's yet to be, I think Stowe would suggest that they might be as long a facade, but apparently not. Anyway, Tunnicliffe based it upon one of Colin Campbell's designs for Wanstead, here in north of London. The work started in 1730, and by 1740, when this painting by Philip Mercier was painted, showing the main block complete. And here we have Thomas resplendent as a knight of the Bath, and his eldest child sitting there, bemused by it all, I think. The realized building, virtually complete on the outside by 1745, is here at Mr. Flitcroft claims ownership, because he was employed, as Ralph Tunnicliffe died in 1736, and he took over. And here we have this drawing, which I'm most grateful to Historic Deerfield for letting me have this image. And it's dedicated to the Marquis of Rockingham. So it must post-date 1745, when he was awarded, when he was raised to be a Marquis. Very fine engraving, very fine pediment with gilded letters telling us that God is our guide. What I forgot to mention is that these statues on top of the pediment on either side still survive today, and we have abundance in the middle, guarded, if you like, or supported by strength on one side in the form of Minerva and Justice on the right. The wings were, Flitcroft gave them Venetian windows around all faces of that first floor, which meant really an observation post rather than a useful place. And John Carr, when he was employed, he introduced an extra level and gave a little bit more gravitas to that connecting wing. And the South Tower today is being restored as a holiday let for the Landmark Trust. So I think we can all look forward to signing up for that. In 1773, John Carr decided to raise the standard of the interior for Lady Rockingham. It was meant for her closet. And it not only provided a neoclassical roof, but also these plaster medallions of there's a sacrifice and there's autumn and summer above the doors. These lunettes, 6 of those, and also these little roundels provided by Joseph Wilton and George Davy. And last but definitely not least, this plaque above the fireplace, which was carved by Nollekins. And here we have the story of Timoclea and family being presented to Alexander. I'm sure you all know the story, but she'd been raped by a Thracian captain who demanded to know where the silver was kept. She said they put it down the well and covered it in rocks. So as he was peering in to look at it, she upturned him into the well. So the Thracians were not happy. You can see this look of anger on his face. But I think Alexander admired the spirit and quality of the lady and actually told his armies that he must not, or they must not persecute the woman and her family. Nollekins carved this. I think it's a freestyle carving. I have not yet found any source for it. Sold at the Royal Society of Arts Summer Exhibition in 1764 and purchased by Lord and Lady Rockingham. The lunettes provided by Joseph Wilton are based upon the engravings by Pietro Bartoli, who published them in the 1680s. And here we have Mercury presenting the young soul to Hades and Persephone, which may well have a feeling of regret for Lady Rockingham because they never had children. Now we're going to just look on the ground, on the first floor, because we haven't got that much time to really cover everything. And we'll start on our enfilade here in what became known as the drawing room, but in fact, originally was the old state dining room. Somewhat over the top in decoration, but full of fascination. The ceiling was created by 2 previously unknown Italian stuccoists. In the corners, these sort of valedictory emblems with the faces of Diana and Apollo appearing in this sunburst, or in the day it was called a blaze, and supported by these precocious little putti. So Mr. Biccottini's had his own room for a couple of years, and he was assisted by Mr. Rizzolini. But this style has no comparison, as far as I know, with any other stucco work in the UK. The walls, however, were given over to Joseph Rose. So the grand dining room and some very expensive pieces agreed with Mr. Flitcroft at £10 each with 6 bas reliefs, 2 large picture frames at £10 each. So required significant amount of money and effort to create them. And the roundels themselves were dedicated to 3 of the goddesses, or 3 of the gods, Diana again, Apollo, and Hercules. And they take their inspiration from the Arch of Constantine. And you can see that these roundels above the secondary arches and on the end, telling stories of, again, goddesses, gods, and heroes like Hadrian and Antinous. They were engraved by Francois Perrier in 1638-45 and transferred into stucco by Joseph Rose. A sixth was in fact based upon a fragment in the Medici collection showing Augustus supplicating to Rome. And Rome, in the form of the goddess Diana, is making a tally of the votes, whether they will accept the emperor as an Augusta. The fireplace in the room, almost certainly a design by William Kent. The fireplace below came up from London and shows Bacchus in the center. Above the mantel shelf, Bacchanalian putti and amaretti are gathering the grapes, and this has been beautifully realized in the stucco. Based upon the famous temple, or sorry, tomb of Bacchus, which is now in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, showing the grape harvest in all its glory, engraved by Anton Degotet and later by Piranesi. And not to be outdone, the local sculptor from Doncaster, Christopher Richardson, carved these faces of the gods and flora and fauna to go above the doors. In the 1760s, the room was renamed the Whistle Jacket Room for obvious reasons, because George Stubbs' famous painting, which now hangs in the National Gallery, was placed in one of these stucco frames designed by Flitcroft and made by Rose. Next door was the so-called Van Dyck room. And we can see the famous Van Dyck of the first Earl to the left of the fireplace, Archbishop Laud in the middle, and then there are Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria, Lord Baltimore, a whole range of paintings which are still in the family collection, as are most of the pieces of furniture that you can see. The table we'll talk about later, the corner sofas, again, still in the family collection. In the ceiling, probably provided by Perrett and Rose. Mr. Perrett died in 1749, so it was Joseph who just took over. But the portrait medallions may have been done by the Italians. They are slight variations on a theme, and I like to think of them as the four Finch girls who were so heavily involved in the design of the building. And the anteroom, no, not the anteroom, but the fireplace in this room, again, probably a William Kent design, but we've yet to prove that. The pediment wasn't added, but the fireplace came up from London, probably from Henry Cheer's workshop. And these wonderful caryatids and the urn with the so-called Borghese dancers. Next door in the anteroom We have other famous paintings, not least this wonderful evocation of the first Earl and his Secretary of State, Sir Thomas Mannering, looking on, based on earlier models from Italian collections, but probably painted by Van Dyck in about 1740 or so. And maybe anticipating the fact that he was being attained for treason, trumped up charges. He thought he was okay because he thought the king was his friend, but he was known to have said later, "Put not your trust in princes." And in 1641, he was executed. In the anteroom, only the fireplace below was constructed, and this and the fireplace before, again, probably supplied by the Henry Cheers workshop, but not actually installed in situ until the 1760s when James Stewart became involved. Now we know that the first Marquess died in 1750, and I've been desperately trying to find a picture of the son, the heir, Charles, but I'm not absolutely sure this is it. I think this might be the elder brother William with the eldest of the children, Anne. But it could be. We have yet really thought that out. But we know he went on his grand tour in from 1748 to 1750. And this charming little pocket volume, which survives in Sheffield Archives, tells us who he met, who he dined with, who he supped with, and who he thought were the most handsome people, which were mostly women. But anyway, you can see the little dots. That was his little code. And so he covered most of important cities in Italy and went up through to Hanover. And in fact, was going to go to Paris, but actually didn't because the father died. When on his trips, he wrote back to his sisters, not to the father, which was a matter of grievance for the father. But he saw this statue of Spes, the goddess of hope. And he said in the letter, "As I see on my coins." And I think that was a really major important source of imagery, not just of faces of important people, but also images like the goddess of hope. And in fact, he was a very strong supporter of collecting coins and medals. Started when he, at the age of 15, and right to the end in 1782, was still collecting. He thought he had the finest collection in Europe, which was not really true, but I mean, it was a serious collection. In Florence, he saw this statue being finished off in the workshop of a Mr. Forgini, and with showing Sansom slaying the Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. Now, at age 18, he didn't actually seek permission from his father, but he realized that his father and all the Whigs, certainly in the North, would have appreciated the allegory. He also took with him a sketch of one elevation of the great saloon or great hall. And the father commissioned him to find statues for the niches. Anyway, he found that there were none to be had. They'd all gone to Rome to fill up the Capitoline Museum and elsewhere. So he decided to commission statues from two English sculptors based in Rome. The kid with the faun and the dancing faun, the Medici Venus and the Apollina were carved by Joseph Wilton and Samuel Verlip, an Irish carver. He commissioned four from three of the Italian sculptors, who were Mr. Della Valle and Mr. Mani and Cavaceppi. So the Antinous on the left is by Cavaceppi, and Della Valle carved this amazing statue of Germanicus based on the one which is now in the Louvre. Also, Stuart wrote to Lord Rockingham, the second Marquis, saying that he would endeavour to ornament the room in the purest taste I can imagine, which he did. And this is details from a much larger watercolor in the family collection, showing the scagliola decoration, the columns to the bases and above, as well as all the various panels. So Stuart was involved in the whole decoration, not just the panels above. And here we have the Grand Hall today. Originally, Rockingham wanted to replicate the design of the ceiling in the floor, but that never happened in his lifetime. Although in the middle of the 19th century, when present floor was laid, it does follow to some extent that sort of design, pattern design. And it was the scagliola done by Charles Clavici, who was basically part of the household for nearly 20 years. His last commission was to do 3 small tables in 1782, in the year of Lord Rockingham's death, and these tables still survive in the family collection. The panels above, designed by Stuart, wingless Greeks, sphinxes, torches. The griffins, the family crest, based on Degatet's drawings, and the endorsed cornucopia taken from a Piranesi sketch, with the Grecian jug set within a valedictory laurel. So we've seen what was the old stateroom, state dining room. We've seen Van Dyck Andrew Saloon, museum, and upper dining room come next. So the museum room suddenly in 1782, when Lord Rockingham died, became a repository for a collection of sculpture, which had been at the Grosvenor Square House and had been all shipped up to Wentworth Woodhouse. Not just what you see here, what is behind the photographer, and also pieces stored down in the room below in the South Tower. Even some of the antique statues just lolling on the floor, just waiting to be kicked, scratched, or butted. So it was just an impossible situation. I don't think Earl Fitzwilliam and his wife had any particular interest in sculpture, although they did order a few things themselves later on. And we don't have time really to talk about it all, but I'm just picking on this one set piece of statue of Paris with his golden apple, Judgment of Paris. The winner of the competition, as you know, is Venus. She offered him the chance of meeting the most beautiful woman in the world. We know where that went. The losers were Minerva. She can't believe that she subjected herself to that humiliation. And Juno, you can see the ferocity in her throat and her gestures. Again, somebody was going to pay for the fact that she'd been treated so badly. Anyway, these 4 statues were acquired by the Getty, and they now have pride of place in one of the rooms and put together in the way that Lord Rockingham had anticipated. And I don't think there is any other group of statues that had been contemplated or achieved in such a manner. So maybe the word unique might suffice. There were 2 centaurs based upon the famous Fioretti centaurs in Rome, but these are between half and 2/3 size. The old centaur bound by love, and in fact, if you're around on the other side, you can see his arms are actually tied behind him using the tail of the pelt of a panther. And whereas the young centaur is being tempted by love. So fascinating. Probably carved by Cavacepi in Rome, but acquired by Lord Rockingham in the 1760s. The room next to it was the new dining room. The children, this Van Dyck of the children above the fireplace. The famous painting of Lord Rockingham around the time that he was made Prime Minister. Apparently, he applied to the king to be elevated to a duke, but the king refused. There's quite a long story why he refused, but I think it was done in spite. And then the adjoining panels were faces of heroes. Theocritus, of course, was supposedly the father of epic poetry, and faces like Hector, Agamemnon, Achilles, all part of that great heroic story of Troy. The fireplace that is there today wasn't installed until after Lord Rockingham's death, but the design that you see on the left by John Fisher of York survived. It had the actual drawing had been thrown in a tip, but rescued by a local historian, given to Dick Reed, the famous York sculptor, who looked after it. And hopefully it will go back to Wentworth Woodhouse. The furniture provided by Wright and Elwick, still there. I should say still there, I mean still in the family collection. Huge sideboards, pier tables, a massive central table and 42 of these chairs by the Wakefield firm. Again, lovely if they came back for an exhibition or so. Down on the ground floor, we don't really have time to talk about the family apartments, maybe for another day. But the pillared hall leading to the new central staircase had these particular statues in composite stone by George Davy, showing the fallen gladiator, or fallen, or the vanquished Gaul, whichever you want to describe it. And the staircase itself, the John Carr's last commission between 1802 and 1805. A statue in the center of a famous goddess, Ariadne, supposedly was excavated at Herculaneum. Now, the Pope had had a block on anything discovered at Pompeii, Herculaneum, or Plontis. But Thomas Jenkins, the foremost antique dealer, I think, in Italy at the time, managed to smuggle it out. Although he did say to Lord Bessingborough, a friend who was negotiating the deal, said, Jenkins wants an extra 20 guineas or it has to go to Rome. So clearly he paid up. But it has been repaired and really makes a fabulous statement on the Great Staircase. Now the west and this, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last bit. The west front and the east front linked together by this 130-foot long gallery. And it contained, I think there were over 50 paintings in this room alone. Only 2 fireplaces, both with inserted panels and these Pegasus capitals taken from Serlio's book. The second fireplace, again, inserted panel. I originally thought these were, this was a funeral procession, but Ariadne A. Menino pointed out to me that actually it's based upon the famous Marlborough gem. And it shows the secret marriage of Cupid and Psyche. Now, one extraordinary survival is this catalogue of paintings. 258 paintings in the mansion in 1870. Beautiful little watercolors, annotated, not just the subject matter, but also annotated, telling us which sale they were sold at or sold in, or whether they stayed in the family possession. Now, I'm just going to run through some of them we've already identified. This painting by Curcino is now in the National Gallery. This painting of the Italian poets. There is another version in Minneapolis Museum of Art. Salvador Rossi's painting of Jason and the Dragon is supposedly his best painting. It's now in the Montreal Museum of Art. The Herons by Castile and its pair, the poultry, were still in the family collection. Although had been, as you can see the annotation, at Cullartin, which was the Irish country house of the family. The infant Hercules, a study for the much bigger canvas which went to Catherine the Great. Benjamin West's picture of the shepherd, Seymour, realizing that there was more to life than just looking after sheep. This and its companion is now in the Los Angeles Museum of Art. And this fabulous little painting by Guido Reni of the Sleeping Cupid. We know it from a Rockingham ceramic plaque that you can see here, painted by George Speet. Lucretia, which is now thought to be by Guccino. And in the chapel, the 12 apostles, and with Christ, named in the catalogue as a Palmer. And actually, you can see the numbering on the frame, which relates to the numbering in the catalogue. It must be the same for the other paintings. I've yet to check it out. The apostles were not there in 1870 when that pictorial catalogue was done. And they could have gone to Milton or could have gone to the London Townhouse, but they were certainly back by about 1920. We could see quite a large number of religious paintings coming into the collection, probably collected by the fourth Earl Fitzwilliam. This Del Sarto is now in the Wallace collection. This Holy Family is now attributed to Lotto and shows the infant St. John and Holy Family. The mocking of Christ by Carracci, supposedly one of its best and was greatly admired by people like Vaughan and the Reverend Richard Warner, who was a fellow when he did his trip through the north of England. And this School of Raphael, it was interesting that, again, we see it as a plaque by George Speet. And it was interesting that the fourth Earl had said to the artist, go through my collection and choose whatever subject you like. And so these ceramic plaques are just stunningly good. I'm still seeking the so-called Leonardo da Vinci painting of the Magdalene. The Samson slaying the Philistines, again, that sort of important Whig subject by Giordano, was sold for 2 guineas, can you believe it, at the Henry Spencer sale. Number 82 is actually Ronaldo and Amelia, but it was bought as a Van Dyck and during the sale in 1948 was purchased by Mallet as a Van Dyck as well. And the Christ with the Virgin was apparently part of the Duke d'Orléans collection. Finally, horse racing. The stables, this gigantic stable block by John Carr. And painting, a dozen or so paintings by Stubbs. And I think this one showing Mr. Cobb, the groom, trying to calm Whistlejack, who was a notoriously sprightly horse, shows that Stubb was more than capable of painting the human form as well as that of the horse. And the mansion today, Sarah MacLeod, Dame Julie Kenny, and the trustees have done a fantastic job in raising £7 million for the roof alone, a couple of million for the South Tower. There's a conservatory in the garden, which is going to be converted into a super cafe. There's going to be proper car parking. So I think the future is looking good. But they have a 20-year plan, and we all need to do it, whatever we can to help them. Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if you could just clarify two things. The four Judgment of Paris figures that are now in the Getty, which room were they in Wentworth? And secondly, when you referred to furniture being with the family, does that mean it's at Milton, or is it distributed through a variety of family properties?
Question number one is you saw the picture of the museum room, and the four statues were right at the back. You would hardly notice them, but in the Grosvenor Square house, they had been just outside Lord Rockingham's closet, and actually right next to that big painting of Samson slaying the Philistines. The second question is slightly less easy to articulate, but Lady Juliet Tangel lives at a place called Bourne Park near Canterbury, and much of the collection that had been designated as part of the Countess Maud Settlement Trust is with her. But there are some pieces of furniture which are at Milton. It was quite interesting that when the two families were doing a divvy up, they decided that Lady Juliet would get those pieces worth more than 400, and the people at Milton would get those pieces worth less than 400. But that got very mixed and muddied over time. So, yeah.
Can you tell me why the griffin and the statue of Hercules meant something to the Whigs? They do seem to have a lot of griffins, and there was a statue of Hercules in the garden somewhere.
Yeah, the most awful statue of Hercules you can imagine. It just made me ill when I looked at it. Well, when you think of the dining room, the original dining room, you are being invited in to join gods and heroes. So you were going to be dining with these people. So Hercules, being a demigod, was part and parcel of that palette of great godlike figures. And the family seemed to have a big passion for Diana and Apollo. As far as the griffins were concerned, they were considered quite an interesting armorial decoration relating to strength and valor, and they became part of the coat of arms of the Wentworth family. So that's really why they appeared throughout.
My name is Mark Hassel. I've just one or two things which little points that I wanted to raise and mention. On the statue, which I think you said was by Cavachepi of Aphrodite, but with her head turned around, looking over her shoulders like this. There's a copy of the same statue at Holcombe, and she's called Aphrodite Kalipiji, which means Aphrodite of the beautiful bottom, because she's admiring her backside. Then I don't think you had somebody said something about the statue of Hercules in the garden, and there are sometimes you have statues of Hercules in the garden where they're holding their hands behind their back with the golden apples of the Hesperides, and these were particularly suitable for orangeries. It was a sort of joke, but I don't think your Hercules had oranges.
No, he was wrestling with a monster,
Yes.
and it's so badly worn, it's difficult to know what the monster was. But the point you made about the Carthaginian Venus was just such a great joke at the time, wasn't
Yes.
it? The competition, apparently, it happened when a young man was passing through a village, and two young girls decided to collar the young man and say, "We would like you to judge the quality of our bottoms. Who's got the best bottom?" And so the girl who was chosen was married to the young man. And luckily, he had a brother who married the other girl. So the village and the area venerated these girls as a way of elevating themselves from or good fortune, really. And there were temples springing up around dedicated to those girls. And so she's looking at her bottom.
Thank you very
In
much.
admiration.
I wondered if you could tell us what's likely to happen to the interiors now. I've been round the house some years ago, and you have these spectacular sort of caves with absolutely nothing in them except the fireplaces and a bit of the statuary,
Yeah.
of course, all the plasterwork.
Well,
But it's an enormous undertaking.
It is
Whatever is to happen
a-
inside those rooms.
It is a huge undertaking, I agree. Now that the roof is completely sound, then perhaps some careful decoration might take place. And it's entirely possible that once the security environmental conditions are sorted, then we might start to see some of the paintings come back, some of the furniture come back, even the silver. It's entirely feasible that we could recreate that new dining room with a table setting, because the 1782 inventory is fantastically detailed, and the Christie's sale catalogues are enormously helpful. So, yeah, I think we could do a whole range of exhibitions lasting for the next 20 years. Maybe just bringing parts of the building to life rather than the whole in one full sweep.
Can I take this opportunity again to thank you for a really splendid lecture, and we look forward to seeing more of this fantastic project as the house is brought back into public domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I give notice that the next meeting will be held on Thursday, the 16th of March at 5 p.m, when we will hear a paper by Dr. Simon Timberlake, Before the Great Orme, the Discovery and Exploitation of Metal Ores in Early Bronze Age Britain. The meeting stands adjourned.